Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here with Dr. James McGrath. He is a professor in New Testament at Butler University in Indiana. He has a PhD from Durham University, and he studied under James Dunn. I know that a lot of my listeners will like James Dunn. I've always appreciated James Dunn's work too, and I've also appreciated Dr. McGrath's work as well. We're specifically going to be talking about a new book that Dr. McGrath has out. It's called The A to Z of the New Testament. I have read this book and I really enjoyed it. And I think I think we'll talk maybe about a couple subjects, but one of the big subjects I want to talk about is sort of how do we understand this role between communicating sort of academic knowledge and studies and research on the New Testament and communicating that to sort of an interested lay audience. And what's the roles of books? What are the roles of professors and researchers? What are the roles of weird YouTubers like me? And as well as digging into the content of some of the book. Dr. McGrath has been on my podcast one time before. We talked about Christology in Paul and things along those lines. You know so much about so many interesting subjects. I feel like there are multiple episodes I also want to do with you in the future about Mandeanism and the John the Baptist. I know that you're doing some research on that subject, so hopefully we'll have you on sometime again for talking about those things. But for now, we're going to be focusing on the A to Z of the New Testament. So do you want to maybe introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about why you wrote this book and what your goals were?
Yeah. Well, Sam, it's great to have a chance to talk to you again on the podcast. Please do call me James. And yeah, we can come back to, I'll have 2 books about John the Baptist coming out next year. And I mentioned that both because that will be an obvious time in the run-up to those coming out to revisit our connection and have that conversation. Not that I'm not happy to talk about that anytime, like so many other things. But this was the first time, right, writing those books about John the Baptist, that I tried to separate 2 things that I've usually tried to do all at once, which was doing scholarship, but trying to make sure it's at least somewhat accessible, or writing for a general audience, but trying not to skimp on the important details. And I think writing the A to Z of the New Testament immediately before turning my full attention to that project. I had a year-long sabbatical last academic year, focused on John the Baptist. And I think all of this sort of hangs together quite naturally, because what scholars do, right, is on the one hand, very, very detailed, concentrated on, minutia and lots of evidence, things in original languages, ancient artifacts, all kinds of things that at that level of detail are not of interest to most people, I think it would be safe to say. Right? There are plenty of people who'd be interested in, what's the significance of this find, or what does this text say, and how does that inform our understanding? But getting into the really nitty-gritty of deciphering something that's a little bit obscure, correlating lots of pieces of evidence, that's something that is something scholars do for other scholars. But if that's all we do, and the fruits of that never get communicated to anyone, then it becomes something irrelevant, right? And that's not just true in the study of religion or the New Testament. I mean, that's true in biology, right? You can have lots of progress being made in our understanding of, biology or of physics or of cosmology or something like that. But if people are not being informed about the conclusions in a way that they can understand, and a way that helps them appreciate the relevance and importance of this, such as it is, then there's an important piece of the scholarly endeavor that's missing, right? Where we'll have fewer and fewer people getting closer and closer to an accurate understanding of something. And as important as that is, there's another piece to that is crucial. And so the reason I wrote the A to Z of the New Testament was precisely because there's this huge disconnect between people in churches and what scholars do, and one that doesn't have to be there, but which it hasn't been obvious prior to writing this book how to best address it, right? there are definitely pastors and even maybe some theologians and people involved in the life of the church who think that ordinary people sitting in pews are not capable of tackling some of these things that scholars study, afraid that if they know that there are variants in manuscripts, if they know these kinds of truths about the New Testament, what's behind the translations they read, that their faith will be shaken. And in my experience, the only time one's faith is shaken by the truth, let's say, right? The accurate information about any subject is if you've been taught up until that point that things are simpler and clearer and different from that, right? And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That some people exclude all of this, tell everybody that, look, it's simple, here is the truth, you can believe it. And then when somebody discovers it, they lose their faith and they're like, see, I told you so. But the person who told them it was simple and connected their faith with that idea of this simplicity and the simplistic perspective of what their faith entails and what's behind it actually caused the problem, right? It wasn't the scholarship that caused it. It was the disconnect. It was the recognition that they'd been lied to by whoever told them it was simple when it was in fact complex.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that people are capable of understanding these things. I think that scholarship about the New Testament, about any subject, enriches our lives, right? And if the New Testament is important to you, then understanding what scholars do actually will enrich your appreciation of it, will enhance your understanding of it. But even for those who want to communicate to a general audience in churches, I mean, the synoptic problem or debates about Christology it's not a great Sunday morning sermon, right? That's what that genre, not what most people want to hear in a message is like, well, here, let's discuss this and that, and get into all that detail, and most people are going to be falling asleep. And it's not because the stuff isn't interesting, but what you're looking for in a sermon is not that, right? Now, lots of churches have Sunday school classes, but the pastor often is the only person in a church, a typical church anyway, who has actually studied a lot of this stuff. And so without some resources being given to Sunday school teachers, adults, but also, for younger members of churches and younger people coming up through churches, then they're not going to know this stuff. And because they haven't heard it in sermons and they've never been to university to study these things. And so I felt like there was in the public, the informing of the public about what scholars conclude, one of the things that was missing was a good resource for the ordinary person outside of churches, but also average people in churches, Sunday school teachers, to have these things presented in a way that was engaging and fun so that you didn't have to already find some of these things interesting or know what some of these key words mean and things like that, right? You look at the typical introduction to the New Testament, and a lot of it is going to seem like it's going to be, they're going to discuss the date, they're going to discuss the author, and even the question of why you discuss who wrote the thing when I've always heard that this was written by such and such a person is not immediately obvious, right? And so a lot of that can seem either boring or unnecessary unless you work into it inductively. And so that's what I tried to do in the book, was to take a passage, take a story, take some point that is worth digging into, give a little taste of what makes it interesting or what's challenging about understanding it, or where we might have gotten something wrong. And then from there, try to work slowly into what scholars conclude and how we conclude it without skimping on the substance, but while trying to make it as fun as possible. And I'm hoping that I achieved that, but it's really for others to tell me, because one thing that your listeners may or may not know about academics, but anyone who's in the realm of publishing will tell you, is that most academics are notoriously bad at actually communicating what we do for a general audience. And even I'm not beyond that. I've just been practicing. And so hopefully I'm getting at least a little better at it some of the time if I try really hard.
Yeah, sure. So I don't currently work in academia or science now, but I have a little bit in the past, but mostly in biomedical research as a statistician. And most of my career, I was researching and helping publish papers that were difficult to explain to even, say, my parents or something like that. And then a couple of years ago, I found myself researching the COVID vaccines right during the middle of the COVID pandemic. And then suddenly everybody cared about that. And it was weird shifting from studying stuff that most of the time most people don't care about to studying something that was a huge culture war lightning rod and extremely relevant, and like friends and relatives asking me, what should I do? Should I get this booster? Should I not get this booster? All these sorts of questions. And sometimes I feel like studying the New Testament is a little bit like the latter, where it can, I mean, the New Testament has to be one of the most studied books in history. And it's not for no reason that that's the case. It's because it's still very relevant and powerful in many people's lives, in our culture, in debates, and all sorts of things. So how does it feel researching something that so many people care about in their everyday lives and have opinions about, and connecting that sort of kind of abstract, kind of cold-hearted academia with, live, hot, real discussions in the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's a real privilege to be able to do this for a living. I mean, I get to think about, talk about, read about, write about things that I think are important and interesting. And I mean, that's a real privilege in and of itself. On the other hand, if you take the time to think about what scholarship does, then it probably would become obvious even to somebody who hasn't done this before, but just informs themselves a little bit about what academics do, that the more general interest there is in a topic, the more people are going to want to work on that topic, and the harder it's going to be to say anything that's new and or interesting. And the more people that have worked on a particular text, a particular subject, the less likely it is that any new idea that we do manage to come up with is going to be correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I think is often a point of misunderstanding when people read, archaeology headlines, biomedicine headlines, astronomy headlines, whatever it is that scholars are trying to come up with something new. They're trying to explore new avenues, and that means taking risks, right? Trying out new ideas, trying to measure things in new ways, whatever it is that we're working on. And sometimes what seems like an exciting, promising new result under closer examination turns out not to be, right? And so no new just published paper in any field of academic inquiry definitively proves or disproves something, right? It might with hindsight, but at that moment when it first appears in print, it's too soon to say it's shown this or that to be the case, right? It makes a case for something, and then the wider community will look at it, will analyze it, and either most people will be persuaded by it and will try to replicate it, we'll investigate other aspects of it, we'll approach it from new angles, and we'll say, oh yes, look, wow, this is, or maybe 9 times out of 10, they'll say, yeah, nope, I think
Yeah.
And so that's what we do, right? And yet whenever somebody comes up with something new, right, journalists will be looking for headlines, and I understand that, and sometimes we'll sensationalize it even more than, a scholar would writing about the subject. But then the public sees this thing and it's like, okay, they found a text, they're faster than light neutrinos, and Jesus was married according to this text and various other things. And then when they say, sorry, no, you're like, well, we just can't. So what scholars are trying to do is to push our knowledge, to make progress, because there are still things we don't understand, or still things that we think we understand, but we still might be wrong about, right?
Yeah.
And it's ultimately the consensus of scholars, right? That is what we need to look at. And if there is a consensus, given that we're pushed to disagree in this way, the consensus probably means the evidence is very strong. If there are a whole bunch of different views that are quite distinct, then the evidence probably is not clear, right? And that's one of those areas in which we may still need further work. But often those areas are not the ones that everybody is so fascinated by, right? They're fascinated by Jesus and Paul, and you do something on John the Baptist, and it's like, well, okay, yeah, we're interested in him too, but mostly because of his connection with the other.
Yeah. So I feel like the 20th century has been a pretty big century when it comes to New Testament studies. Like you said, if you're studying the most studied book in the world, sometimes it might feel like there's hardly much new to say. But I feel like the 20th century, with archaeological discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, the Ugaritic Library. You've done a lot of work on the Mandean Library. So there were a whole bunch of things that came or reemerged, I guess, in some sense, into our knowledge in the 20th century that I feel like have had pretty profound changes on the New Testament, or at least are not changes on the New Testament, obviously changes on our understanding and approach to the New Testament. And so how do you feel like some of those developments over the 20th century have impacted things?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right that we've had important discoveries, right? And this is one reason why, even though it is a good principle, that, if something seems too good to be true, the headline seems too sensational, then it probably is not going to turn out to be true. But sometimes we make amazing finds, right? Ancient Gnostic library unearthed in Egypt, right? It sounds like, well, okay. No, really, we did. Caves near the Dead Sea hold manuscripts from the time of Jesus, right? And there are so many instances of that. That's precisely why people who are looking to forge something can get away with it, because it's in principle possible, right? It's And so we've had really crucial finds during this period. That's why if you're reading scholarship online, right, some of the stuff that you can get without copyright and circulates easily and legally online are things that are, maybe 100 years old or more. And so maybe from before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi texts or other things. And so older work won't reflect our best current understanding of things. It can still be useful, but that has an impact. On the other hand, right, scholarship moves slowly. And so so some of us have been made to feel really old in recent years when students have asked, so this thing from the late 20th century, is that too old to cite? And I'm like, oh my gosh, really? No. It's like, oh yeah. But scholarship does move, and it is, some of those things that we read, when we were students as undergrads, actually are, getting a little bit dated now, and there's, and it's hard to keep up with things. So finding that balance between reading things that have, if you're a general person, general audience trying to inform yourself about something, looking at things that are old enough and established enough that they represent, the state of the field, but not so old that they lack certain things that have come to light more recently or recent work that's been done. And so the latest article is not the best place to go to get a sense of the consensus necessarily, but neither is something that's 100 years old. And somewhere in between is where, we have and there are differences and nuances between different scholars. Things may be changing slowly. Often we don't realize how much a field is changing, except with the benefit of some hindsight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you had to predict, do you think the 21st century will have as many discoveries or fewer discoveries? Do you feel like we sort of picked the fruit off of that tree in some sense, that, we've combed the desert and we found what there was? Or do you feel like there are still a lot of things that are unanswered, a lot of books that might still be out there, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, the truth is we don't know. And certainly in places like the Holy Land, so much that is likely to be of significance for people with interests like ours is underneath buildings that people live in, right? Or underneath structures of some sort. And there were efforts at one point to try to dig underneath the Temple Mount, right? And there's this Temple Mount sifting project because some earth that was relocated from there and was then cast aside actually has some important artifacts in it, and that's actually proved useful. But you can't dig there, right? It was shaking neighborhoods, right? It was putting lives in jeopardy and causing conflict, right? Among
not to mention geopolitical difficulties on
right. Yeah. And who's digging and under whose neighborhood, and how's this impacting them? And your house is shaking and stuff is and so there are definitely things to be found, and going to be less and less probably opportunity to find things. But there are still things in libraries, right? Both university libraries, but also monasteries. They're just not adequately cataloged, maybe misidentified, and so nobody's ever paid any attention to it. And for the Mandaeans, for instance, right? I mean, their texts, until Charles Heberl and I worked on translating the Mandaean Book of John, that text, one of their two most important sacred texts, had not been translated into English in its entirety by scholars, with a critical edition and commentary and things like that. And so between that and things like Christian Apocrypha, sources that preserve ancient, maybe not historical, but nonetheless interesting reception of biblical figures, we have so much that still hasn't been translated, still hasn't been studied, or has only been studied a little. Maybe it was published once, 100 years ago in some obscure journal, that there's plenty of room to do things without having to risk being duped by somebody who's, saying, hey, look what I found. And they're in fact, an antiquities dealer who got something from a forger or may forge something themselves. So I want to balance, caution with optimism, because anyone, probably somebody right before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi text would have said, we've probably found everything crucial that we're going to find. And people have said that in physics too, right? We're nearing the point where we're going to say we've got it all wrapped up and understand everything. And then, lo and behold, something creates some problems and throws some interesting new angles and evidence into the mix.
Sure. If there were one artifact that you think existed in history that we don't currently have access to, that if we could find it somehow, what would you pick?
Oh, that's a tough one. I feel like somebody's asked me this before, and I feel like I've answered it before, and yet the more I think about it, the more I'm like, oh, I wish I'm pretty sure there, I mean, I would love to have the Gospel of Peter, for instance, which I think is early enough that it has independent traditions in it, and have that in its entirety. I think that's one that would be really interesting to have. I would love to have the untampered with version of what Josephus wrote about Jesus. I think that's another one that I would love to have. We may have glimmers of it, right? Because there's this Arabic Christian author named Agapius who offers a paraphrase of what Josephus wrote and leaves out all the distinctively Christian bits. And so I think we probably have hints of it there, but, would still like to have what Josephus wrote. And there are other things, I'm pretty sure there were John the Baptist sources that we no longer have. And those would be pretty nice to have too. I would do some serious work on those if those came to light. As it is, what I did in this research was trying to catch glimpses of some of those sources behind the text that we do have. And I think there are hints that there were early sources about John the Baptist, maybe about his infancy and things like that, known to Luke, known to the Mandaeans, known to others. But it would be great to have those. I mean, it's hard to pick one. It's like, favorite song by your favorite band. It's usually it's like, okay, I can pick my top three, maybe, and even then it's
right.
I'd be sorry for the things that I'm not.
Which historical concert would you like to go to? Yeah, it's sort of like that question. So one thing that I think is interesting, when the printing press was invented and a lot of religious information started disseminating, that caused all sorts of upheavals in Europe with the Protestant Reformation, Counter-Reformation, various wars of religion, all of these sorts of things. It was very exciting, disruptive, dangerous, innovative, all mixed together and sort of a potent brew. And I feel like the internet is doing something now, but yet we aren't like going to war or anything yet. And that there are a lot of sources of information. I mean, this had kind of been true, but I feel like the internet is toning things up to a new level, making new information available. Like, almost anyone now can go on the internet and find virtually any writing from any church father translated into English for free, or at least a very large chunk of it. And that's just, one particular example. And, with a little bit of a budget, you can buy books or academic articles about virtually anything you want. And so and then YouTubers, podcasters, and stuff are making this sort of information available in a new way. And I felt like kind of over the 20th century, there was sort of a growing gap between academic New Testament scholarship and what most people in your average church, or even the clergy or well-educated people in a church, knew. And that it was sort of widening. I mean, obviously, maybe you could point to it, that widening starting in like the 1800s with German higher criticism or something. But I felt like the 20th century, it got bigger. And then there are people like me who grew up with some sort of religious background, who maybe get questions or have doubts or something like that, go on some sort of autodidactic self-exploration journey. There are lots of people probably who grew up with some sort of religious background, maybe went through a period of doubt or got exposed to information that they hadn't heard before, and go on some sort of autodidactic journey, reading these things, listening to podcasts, exploring things on the internet. And that I feel like a lot of the audience of my YouTube channel are people that suddenly feel like they don't know where they can fit in anymore. And that they go to church and maybe they've developed a series of new beliefs on subjects, some of which might be pretty, dogmatically important to their denomination or whatever, or they just feel like there's things that they can't say in church. And there's a lot of people that are in this weird position. So I don't know if you want to speak to that or talk about your experience with that too.
Yeah. And actually, so I came off of the sabbatical thinking I wasn't going to, even think about what my next book will be for a while, right? Deserve a break after, producing, I got 3 books written during the course of the sabbatical, and that plenty. But a topic sort of grabbed my interest, and it was, again, writing for a general audience. And it's on the subject of reconstructing your faith. And so, a lot of people are talking about this process in terms of deconstruction, right? There's a philosophical sense of deconstruction that's at least different in some important ways, but talking about closely examining and sometimes finding that your worldview collapses, right, as a result of taking a close look at it and pulling at things, trying to pull out some things that you realize you can't keep there anymore, and you realize that those were actually part and parcel of the structure. And so figuring out where to go from there and what it looks like to rebuild, precisely because academics like myself have typically gotten involved in the study of the Bible academically because of our faith, and something that was important to us in that way, and then it challenges our faith. And so I feel like we should sort of pass it along, right? And how have we worked through this, and how did we come out the other end, and did we manage to stop saying, oh, I'm a Christian or I'm a whatever, but I don't think this anymore, I don't think that anymore, and instead to say, yeah, I'm a Christian, and precisely as a Christian, I don't believe fundamentalists when they claim to take the Bible literally, because I know the Bible much too well and know what fundamentalists say and do much too well to fall for that sort of marketing, advertising strategy that really is false advertising, And so finding a positive way to talk about where one ends up, rather than defining oneself simply over against where one was. But I think scholarship and the dissemination of scholarship is often crucial to that. On the other hand, oftentimes people will undergo a massive shift because they encounter ideas online that are things they never heard, and so they think it's something that was hushed up, and the people promoting it might say it was hushed up, and yet in actual fact it's not. It's at least no less bogus than what they were taught previously, right?
Right.
You get people who go from being Christian fundamentalists to Jesus mythicists, and denying that there even was a historical Jesus, and are often treating the Bible in the same way and not actually paying enough attention to the details or getting things right in this new standpoint. And so, I think that getting accurate information and disseminating it is crucial. And I think that, all the concerns that the authorities had about the printing press, they were not misplaced, right? You teach people to read, you give them the information, right? And, what was the church worried about? If everybody's interpreting the Bible for themselves, then we're going to have almost as many denominations as there are people. And lo and behold, that's where we are, right?
Right.
And yet I think that ultimately, the key thing is to figure out how to harness this technology for good, right? Because keeping people ignorant is not better, right? But the problem is that misinformation flows using the same technologies as information does.
Right.
And so figuring out how scholars can not leave what we do sort of siloed off behind paywalls, which is one of the problems, or published in obscure journals, or published in books that nobody can afford, while other people are pandering to a wider audience and getting a hearing. And if scholars were writing with the same kind of passion and the same kind of concern to be understood and the same kind of attention to communication, then we have something to say that's actually true, or at least trying to get things right. And often part of the problem is that scholars will say, well, this is as close to the truth as we can get. We can't be 100% sure because history doesn't work like that, things like that. Where somebody else will say, you can just trust me here. I'll show you why. And we'll give you, 3 simple arguments for why, and people do sometimes. I mean, we have a human instinct that desires simplicity and clarity when we can find it.
Yeah.
And, we shouldn't make things more complicated than they need to be, right? And not everybody needs to know all the details that I work on, in some academic publication or other. But oftentimes we fail to digest it, to communicate it, to convey it in a useful way. And I think that's our fault as much as it is anybody else's. It's not fair to for scholars to get together and complain and gripe about the fact that people don't take scholarship seriously, and at least some scholars have not really made an effort to do anything about that.
Yeah. And there are similar and parallel risks for sort of being in this weird sort of YouTuber intermediary space. It's all too easy to want to chase the algorithm and the clicks, and sensationalism, controversialism, combativeness, interdenominational smackdowns, all of these sorts of things are ways that are sort of short-term access to more attention than maybe the more nuanced or complex or fair-minded or sober-minded take on these sorts of things. And that's a responsibility that I feel in tension with too. It's like, well, on some level, if you're investing your time in this, you want people to have access to it. You want to grab people's attention. That's part of why you're doing what you're doing. But, you don't want to just be, driving wedges between people or sensationalizing information that might not turn out to be correct. And what responsibility do I have? I mean, I have no higher authority like a university or anything that I am accountable to. And it's sort of a weird situation to be in. It's free, but it's also a little bit like I need to, watch myself. And so how do you feel like academia, the curious public, and sort of this new electronic internet medium should interact with each other in a way that is healthy and productive, as opposed to, the opposite?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I just had the news on as I was getting ready for work, exercising this morning and things like that. And there's a segment on the local news, Don't Waste Your Money. And today was about somebody who had ordered, had thought they'd found a bargain online for earpods. And in fact, it was fake. It was not authentic Apple product. And did I say earpods when I meant AirPods? I was like trying to think of earpods, and I was like, that's not right. AirPods, and I said,
I knew what you meant.
There you go. And so, that symbolized the fakeness of what it was. Yeah. Anyway, and the person who was commenting on it said, if it looks too good to be true, then it probably is, right? If it seems like you're getting a really great bargain, you're probably not, right? And people are looking for this thing that's really, really valuable, but to get it really, really cheaply. And there are rare occasions when something like that might happen, but in general, what you're going to find online are scammers and things like that. And so just fact checking, right? And not saying, oh, I can't trust this person because they got something wrong, right? Because everybody gets things wrong, right? And so, not
or something we think is right now for good reason turns out to be wrong later,
yes.
despite our best intentions.
Right. Yeah. And some people, I've heard, some of the young Earth creationists, say, oh, look at science. It's always changing. It's like, yeah, that's progress, right? We're getting closer and closer, right? People once thought the Earth was, flat with a dome over it, and then thought it was a sphere with other spheres around it. And now we have a different, and it's not, and we're not going to go back to the flatness, right? We may get more precise measurements of the sphere or something like that, but it's, and realize it's not actually perfectly spherical, right? Is one of the things, right? Which is, and so if you want somebody who's going to give you simple answers, then you're probably going to, you're potentially opening yourself up to, charlatans and people who will take advantage of that, right? And so being willing to listen, being willing to take the time to fact check, right? And that's crucial, I think, in our day and age, because what a lot of people are saying is that they're doing their own research, right? And they actually have no idea what doing research means, like whether it's in a lab or in a library, working through, the evidence in the way that scholars do. What they mean is they've looked online and found somebody else that they've chosen to trust to tell them the truth, right? And that's not doing your own original research. That's not even being a skeptic, right? You may be being skeptical of people you previously trusted, but now you're trusting someone else instead, right? And there's this balance that I think anyone who cares about getting as close to the truth as they possibly can needs to have between taking the time to inform yourself, right? And that's not just through, overpriced, difficult books. That's even through, documentaries, right? But good ones, right? And interviews with scholars, right? And seeing who these people are, and YouTubers, and podcasts, and general audience magazine articles, and all kinds of things.
Although sometimes you do have to buy that overpriced academic book. Sometimes there's no way around it.
Yeah, sometimes. I think that's rarely the case that anyone who's not an academic absolutely has to. But, and one thing that I think often people don't know is you can recommend it to your local public library and they might just get it, right? And that's the older model of academic publishing was actually aimed at libraries, right? Libraries buy this, people borrow it from there. And that's the pricing model. And I think we can do better nowadays with the technology we have. But in the meantime, don't buy the overpriced book if it's going to leave you in poverty. Ask a library first and see if they'll get it.
Also, ask your wife first. General good advice.
Oh, that always good, right? Even if you're going to go on the cheap books shopping splurge, right? Because often you just get more. You spend the same amount, you just get more books, right?
Right. Right.
Which and then you have to have the shelf space and other things, and it's all But I think recognizing that on the one hand, there's effort involved and time involved in becoming sufficiently acquainted as somebody who's not a full-time researcher can with a field, so that you can get a sense, oh, this is a good source. This is what actual scholarship looks like. This looks bogus, right? Because it's doing this, it's doing that. And then on the other hand, recognizing that all of us have to rely on others, right? I mean, I'm not going to, as somebody who works mostly in New Testament, ever going to spend my time working on the original text of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? If I want to interact with that scholarship and with what those texts say, and I do, then I will be either reading them in English translation, the first instance, and then if I'm looking at what the underlying text says, it'll still probably be a printed edition or something like that, right? And so nobody can be an expert in everything. And yet we get closer to an accurate understanding when we bring together the results of different fields. And so that means relying on others, right? And trusting that, not any one individual in another field necessarily, but the field as a whole, right? That because we all have biases, because we all make mistakes, that this effort that involves collaboration, a bit of competition as we, challenge each other's ideas and ask, okay, well, let's see if I can find some problems with this argument that this other person's put forward, that all of that collectively brings us closer to the truth. And then you can look at pretty much any source, that's a mainstream source, a textbook, and get a sense of what the current state of our knowledge is. Right? And what I tried to do in the A to Z of the New Testament was essentially take the stuff that you'd find in that book, but often organized in a systematic way by like books of the Bible. So you go book by book by book, and often goes through the same sort of format. And instead do it inductively, so we're meandering through and only introducing things like scholarly methods of study when you've first had a chance to see why might you need something like that, right? And that reflects my experience in teaching too. If you go into a classroom with people who maybe know the New Testament but have never studied it in an academic way, and you say, well, scholars have come up with these competing hypotheses about the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, a lot of them are going to be like, oh, that sounds like this dodgy scholarly stuff. That's, my pastor made things much simpler than that. If you just give them, okay, here's what seems like it might be the same story, basically, from these three gospels, but they're all a little bit different. Why are they so similar? Why are the differences there? Which one do you think wrote first? And get them to work inductively. And then you say, well, here are some of the possibilities that scholars have come up with. Then suddenly the Q source, right, whether you accept it or not, doesn't seem like, oh, scholars just trying to make things difficult when they're simple. It's, oh, wow, figuring out how these texts relate to one another is actually important for understanding them. And it's not immediately obvious what the relationship is. And so understanding that what scholars are doing is not trying to take your sacred, simple text and pull it apart. They actually are trying to understand the text. And the text itself has these challenging features to it, or these puzzling characteristics that raise questions that deserve answers to which, if we can find them, will help us understand those texts better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now I want to get into the actual subject matter of your book. Because my podcast especially focuses on the Trinity and Christology, the chapter I want to ask you about first is your chapter O on one God. So what I guess, what do you want to say about what does monotheism mean in the context of the New Testament, and how does that relate to the doctrine of the Trinity or not? I know that's a huge subject, but I'm going to ask you that question anyway.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, that was a particularly challenging chapter to write. And that may sound surprising to anyone who knows that that's like right up my alley, right? My scholarship for the first big chunk of my career was focused on that. And I continue to write on this subject. But when you're trying to write for a general audience and you're trying to reflect the consensus of scholars as well as you can, it's particularly how should I put this? It's particularly easy to get on your own hobby horse and do your own distinctive thing and work that in a way that doesn't reflect the consensus. Right?
Sure.
And in this case, I do think that the way that scholars put things sometimes actually hinders general understanding, right? In a lot of commentaries, a lot of things, scholars will say something that's absolutely true, like that, Jesus does in this text, Jesus in this text is depicted as doing what only God can do. But is that because he is the second person of the Trinity walking around in human flesh? Is that because he is God's appointed agent, who is therefore authorized to act with the power of God? And the possibility that this can be understood in more than one way is not explored, precisely because if you try and pin it down further, then you might be facing a heresy trial in your denomination or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so in this chapter, I really tried to present how I understand things, present how scholars in general understand things, but also make people aware that sometimes you have to look really closely at the way scholars are wording things, because they might be being cautious. One of the reasons that I love having my wife in my adult Sunday school class is that I will often tiptoe around things I think are and she will just like ask a direct question, knowing that it's going to get me to force me to say something. And I actually love that she does that, because at least it's not me just driving it. It's a question for somebody else. But I think that one thing we should note right off the bat is that these early Christian authors talk about God being one in a manner that is directly mirrored, right? We find the same exact kinds of things in their Jewish contemporaries who do not share their belief that Jesus is the Messiah. And that, I think, is a crucial starting point, that whatever first century Jews meant by God being one, Christians affirmed that. And they were not so radically changing that, right? I'm not saying they weren't pushing the boundaries or doing anything that was distinctive necessarily, but they were not going against that in a way that would have required them to argue for that and defend their doing so, right? In some of my interactions with Larry Hurtado about the subject, he would say that Christians did these things and made this kind of this mutation in early Jewish monotheism. It's still within monotheism, but I would basically point out that when Paul was saying what he was saying about the law and the possibility of Gentiles being part of Abraham's household without being circumcised, that he needed to spend a lot of time, there needed to be a lot of pen and ink to defend that. And we don't see that in the New Testament, right? We don't see them saying, oh, wait,
here's this tripersonal model. I know this is different. I know that they're going to reject it. Here are 10 Old Testament quotes and foreshadows that I'm going to use to defend this idea. And it's showing up in the book of Acts in their debates and multiple of Paul's letters or something like that, right? You get that sort of thing on the subject of the law, of table communion with Gentiles, of food sacrifice to idols, and all sorts of other subjects. But there is no monotheism debate, or really. And if anything, that is sometimes in the book of Acts a point of agreement that Paul will reach to, as opposed to a source of disagreement.
Yes. And Paul, and it's interesting that it comes up in the debate about faith and works, right? Both Paul and James affirm, God is one, and that's one of the points they share in common. Paul, says it as, just sort of as an axiom of his faith. And so one thing that I think is crucially important is that, to the extent that there were debates about some of the things that were being said about Jesus, the point was not that you could never say such things about anyone, right? Whether it's, the angel Yahuel, right, in certain Jewish literature, and later Metatron, whether it's, the Son of Man, right, that Son of Man figure depicted in the parables of Enoch. We get figures that are, invested with the divine name so that they can serve as God's sort of chief representative, who are subordinate to God and yet receive universal acclamation from the nations and prostration, right? Which essentially is what worship means, right? When you get the word worship in the text. And so the issue what was the key issue between followers of Jesus who were Jews and their Jewish contemporaries who were not followers of Jesus was whether it was appropriate to say these things about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And we even get that in the Gospel of John, right, which arguably goes further Christologically in some ways than some of the other texts that were written earlier. It's, the issue is he making himself equal to God, right? Is he making himself God? Is he making himself this, that, or the other, right? If God has appointed him and exalted him to a status in which he exercises divine authority, that there's really no debate that is something that in principle some figure could do. The debate is about whether Jesus is such a figure, and things like the fact that he was crucified seem to disqualify him from being that Davidic messianic figure.
Yeah. So you brought up Larry Hurtado. I wonder, how do you feel about his hypothesis that the early Christians worshipped Jesus in a way that wasn't just maybe the sort of bowing that you could do to an important person like a king or a master, but was in some sense tiptoeing or trespassing on the sort of worship that you should only give to a deity, and that having implications for the Christology of the earliest Christians. What do you make of his general thesis in that area?
Yeah. So, and this is something that Hurtado and I disagree on. I can't even remember whether I put this in the book, the A to Z book. It's certainly something I explore in some of my other books, specifically about monotheism and Christology. It seems as though the only, type of worship, if we want to call it that, worship in the broad sense in English, that there was general agreement that you could not, under any circumstance, offer to any other figure. It was animal sacrifice, right? The kind of thing that happened in the temple. Other things, right? We have invocations of angels, right, in places that seem like, they're prayer-like at the very least, and why you wouldn't categorize them as prayer, may just reflect, the scholar's framework rather than how the ancient person would have understood it. Bowing, obviously your attitude, presumably in your heart and mind, if you bow before God versus if you bow before a ruler, may be very different, but the action is the same, right? And people recognize that it could be appropriate to bow before a human figure. And when there are objections to it, it's not that it's never appropriate to bow towards another figure, but this figure either is understood to be either in danger of being equated with God, and so worshipped in a different sense, or is understood to be a figure who sort of stands at odds with God, right? And so bowing before them would be compromising one's allegiance to and worship to the one God. So, it seems to me that there is a difference in early Christianity, right? The extent to which there is this kind of praise and worship that goes mostly through, but also sometimes to Jesus, and is thanking God and praising God for Jesus and all these kinds of things. It's different even than the universal worship we get in the parables of Enoch. And I think the reason is not because it's a fundamentally different phenomenon, right? It's pushed the boundary further per se, but to the extent that it may have pushed the boundary a little bit further, it's pushing in the same direction, and it's going further in that direction because the early Christians believe that this figure that the parables of Enoch depicts as a future hope, they believe he's here, and they believe he's now been exalted to that. He's been here, he's been exalted to that status, and so now is the time to do that thing that the parables of Enoch depicts. And so I think they're doing something that fits within that context and is a natural way for Jewish Christians who affirmed God as one to express themselves. And I think in order to account for how we get to the Trinitarian monotheism of the later creeds on the one hand, and the stricter sort of Unitarian monotheism, if we want to use that terminology, that Judaism and later Islam have, a lot of it has to do with debates that occur as a result of Christians doing this, and detractors saying, since they're going there, we're going to say don't go there for anyone, not just in relation to Jesus, and we're going to pull the boundaries back in this direction. And so we get pushing and pulling where both, I think, are being altered through the process of mutual self-definition.
Mm-hmm. You bring up the High Christology Club in that chapter, although I couldn't help but maybe get the feeling that you don't consider. Do you consider yourself a member of the High Christology Club?
Well, first of all, I'll say no, because otherwise you'll get somebody else on here who will say he's not a member.
Where's his membership card? Yeah.
And you probably have heard the story about there was some sort of gathering of the folks that were starting to become known as the early High Christology Club, and people like Jimmy Dunn, who was not really in there, and Morris Casey, who definitely is not in there, were at this meeting, and so somebody gave it a toast to early High Christology, and then Jimmy, I think, if I remember the story correctly, said to High Christology. And then Morris said, to Christology. So, but the idea of an early high Christology club, it's something that has come out as a phrase, but it's a reference to the fact that there are some scholars who think that the early Christians basically very, very quickly went as far as Christology was going to go in at least the major factors, and that the rest was just spelling out and defining and defending of that. And I certainly don't think that. I think there's important development. I think that the creed, the Nicene Creed, the Council of Nicaea, as debate about the oneness of God and Trinitarianism or Binitarianism, or however one wants to define what that was about, was trying to answer questions that the church had been wrestling with, but also new questions, and to answer older questions that were now being framed in terms of the felt need to draw a sharp dividing line between God and creation, where there had been room for blurriness earlier. Mm-hmm. And so Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century, talked about the Logos as neither uncreated like God nor created like you, but between the two extremes. And that sounds a lot like John's, the prologue of John's Gospel saying, the Word was with God and the Word was God. It's like, how can it be both? It's like, well, that's because we're dealing with divine mystery. And it was felt that all these Gnostic emanations and other ideas that were circulating at the time, there need to be pushback against that. So I certainly don't think that you get the Nicene orthodoxy it's just there, just waiting for somebody to define it or properly or find the right terminology for it. That said, I agree very strongly with Bart Ehrman when he says that the earliest Christology has Jesus exalted, highly exalted, super exalted. Paul coins a term, or his source coins a term, to God's right hand, to rule over everything and receive universal acclamation, so that every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. I mean, ultimately the focus is still on the one God, but who's being worshipped by way of this universal acclamation of Jesus. And that's not low Christology, right?
Right.
And yet people will say that because you haven't put the Nicene orthodoxy in there, that it's not, But what about his nature? And is it very God, of very God, and this kind of stuff? And I don't see any evidence that they're thinking in those terms at this point. And I think that when the questions were posed in that term, it changed what was being thought in the process of even answering those questions that were framed differently than our earliest sources care to speak.
That's good. I think I'll let you off the hook for Christology at the moment. What other chapter of the book was your favorite to write?
Oh, interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I love the chance to take things that I know and that scholars have worked on and figure out a way to try and convey them, and to try and do so in a fun way, right? And so I made a few videos to go along with the book, just highlighting some of the pop culture references. But in one of them, I talk about whether Matthew would get a failing grade in New Testament interpretation, and asking questions like that. I mean, that's not a question that anybody in Matthew's time would have asked. And it may seem an irreverent question, but it gives me a chance, on the one hand, to recognize that this book might be used by students, right? It might be read by students who are interested. It may also be used as a textbook, and wanting to address things like, okay, so if they copied from one another, were they doing plagiarism? And if plagiarism is biblical, then why can't I do it? And things like that. But Matthew does things like, quote scripture and talk about fulfillment of scripture in relation to Jesus, and does things that are these kind of problematic moves from the perspective of most people who've been told that what Matthew's talking about is that these prophetic texts predicted Jesus, and then he comes along and the prediction is fulfilled. You go back and read Hosea 11, and out of Egypt I called my son it's talking about Israel. It's not talking about the future Messiah. But the one that I had fun focusing on in that passage, or in that chapter rather, is when Matthew brings in a second donkey, right, alongside, so Jesus riding in on a donkey, and the original text, the Hebrew text that Matthew quotes, and that the Gospels in general quote, has this parallelism, right? So it goes, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey, and that's just parallelism. It's saying the same thing in two different ways, right? Ancient Hebrew poetry does that. You see that in the Proverbs and the Psalms and lots of places. But Matthew suggests that there was a second animal there, right? And that's, he's the only one who does that, and it's his spin on things. And it was just fun to work in, imagining Jesus doing the stunt that Jean-Claude Van Damme does in this famous commercial, right, where there's these two trucks, right,
and he's got his legs between the two,
right, and see Jesus doing the split, right, as he's going, and I do stuff like that, I have fun doing things like that. I tell stories, even prefacing them in class, saying that the story is probably apocryphal, but things like that can help us remember, right? And that's really one of the things I was trying to do, is take what we know about the way that repetition and vibrant imagery and metaphors and pop cultural references, all of that can help us learn by helping us remember, right? Because it latches new information to things that we already know or have in our brains. And so trying to make those connections with Star Wars and whether Han shot first and what you can learn about textual criticism and things like that. Things that I've mentioned in my classes for a long time and have occasionally mentioned, I think, in passing in some other books, but have not really worked into a New Testament book in this way. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to pick a favorite. I'm not sure. Did you have a favorite?
Well, I already brought up my favorite chapter.
Yeah.
So
I thought that might be,
but I'll say so on the when out of Egypt I called my son sort of thing. One thing I feel like that was I don't know, a revelation to me at some point was when New Testament authors don't treat the Old Testament the way I was taught to treat the Old Testament.
Right.
And in a very grammatical, historical, original context of the original author and audience sort of way. And it's like, okay, out of Egypt, I called my son. Well, yeah, you're right. That is not obviously on its surface literal level talking about a messianic prophecy, the way some other things might seem to be more obviously messianic. And so how are the New Testament authors, what's Matthew doing when he's quoting that passage, and why does he think that this is a legitimate argument and interpretive move to make?
Yeah, well, it's not entirely possible that Matthew's trying to pull a fast one, but the reason I don't think that's what's going on is because I think that unlike most modern Christians who only know these words from Matthew and then assume that he's talking about prediction, I think that Matthew was relying on readers actually recognizing these texts, being familiar with them. And so I think when he talks about fulfillment of Scripture, I think he's talking about what might be called typology, right? So in other words, you have a pattern of the people wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and so Jesus goes and is tempted in the wilderness for 40 days, right? There's typology there, right? Knowing 40 wilderness, facing temptations to do these things, brings another story to mind, and then you read the Jesus story, the story about Jesus, through the lens of that other story, and maybe go back later on and read that story through the lens of Jesus. And so there's this transformation that happens through the interplay between these texts. And I think that's what Matthew was doing in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that there's this new layer of meaning to these texts that was, in some sense, revealed through Jesus with a typology or a analogical connection of some way. And yeah, I remember I was really studying the book of Hebrews, and I was like, what in the world? Like, if you actually go back and cross-check some of these things, it doesn't quite add up the way that, I thought. And it took, I think Larry Hurtado's book, one of them at least, helped me with this sort of idea that a lot of their argumentation, and then when you read Justin Martyr, like Justin Martyr, when he's dialoguing with the Jew, most of the time when they're arguing about whether or not Jesus is the Messiah, they're using typology to either say yes or no to that question. but the Jewish dialogue partner of Justin Martyr agrees with that methodology, just maybe not with Justin's own conclusions. And so just understanding the difference in hermeneutical method was something that it took me a while to get my mind around. And so that was helpful.
Yeah. I think, other chapters I really liked, addressing the question of sort of women's roles in the early Christian movement, a chance to talk about that, because in the process, also get to show how you could be reading the Bible in English, but the English translation has made, the translators have made a judgment, have presented things in a certain way that will give readers a certain impression. And so two people in so-called Bible-believing churches could be reading different English translations and both be persuaded that their different view of women in ministry is biblical, and it's, and so things like that I think are important for this kind of general audience.
Yeah.
And then the one about joking and whether there's humor in the New Testament. I could totally see myself at some point actually writing a book about, whether Jesus used humor, and if so, how. That would seem to be something that's right up my alley in some ways.
Yeah. So I have to ask you a question. So when Paul says that women should veil their heads because of the angels, what do the angels have to do with veils on a woman's head in church?
Yeah. And that text is actually really, really challenging in ways that it's hard to realize. I think most English-speaking churches don't actually, pay too much attention to that. But my wife's from Romania. I taught in Romania for 3 years, and there, married women covering their heads in church is actually considered, crucially important. And it's interesting to see how Baptists and Pentecostals actually took different approaches to the application of that. It's one of the places where I think, and this is another thing that I really enjoyed exploring in the book, just to help general audience is that there are no quotation marks in ancient Greek. And in that passage, right, the conclusion that Paul reaches is that for this reason, women should have authority over their head. And then some because of the angels, whatever that means. But women should have authority, right, is his conclusion. And yet that doesn't seem like what he was arguing earlier on. And all throughout his letter to the Corinthians, we see places where it looks like he's quoting what the Corinthians wrote. And so it may be that some of the phrases in there are instances of Paul quoting the Corinthians and what they were saying.
Right. Not Paul speaking in his own.
Yeah.
Like what's the famous example of that? Like some sort of libertine quote or something like, should we keep on sinning or something like that. And it's like one of those things where Paul is quoting probably, a question and not speaking in his own voice.
Yeah. And sometimes we might need like two sets of quotation marks, right? Because Paul might have said at some point, all things are permissible to me, right? I'm not under the law. And then the Corinthians said, hey, Paul, look what we're doing because all things are permissible to me. And then Paul's like, okay, all things are permissible to me, quoting them, quoting him. But, and so, and so realizing that those are the kinds of things that are clear when you're reading a letter from someone, right? We have quotation marks. And so hopefully if you get a letter and somebody's quoting you and something you said earlier, it will be in quotation marks. But even if they were just echoing your phrase, right, you would recognize it. Someone else reading the letter might be really puzzled why you put things that way, right? And so that's another thing that I try to explain in the book is that we're really listening into one end of a conversation and having to piece together what the other side of it sounded like. My guess regarding the angels, and I'm not sure it's right. I'm not even confident it's a good suggestion because it's a really difficult text, is that, it may be a shorthand way of saying, because of, what Jesus said about, the fact that in the resurrection there will be neither marriage nor giving in marriage, but will be like angels. Therefore, because that, the restoration of all things will include this equality and this elimination of the gender distinctions. Therefore, women should have authority over their heads, right? Because Paul's navigating this tension between the fact that he's said some things that are true of the life of the resurrection you should be enacting now, right? You should be putting those ethics into effect now, but you shouldn't be going all the way in that direction, right? And the fact
Mm-hmm.
that some in Corinth were saying, well, we're going to be like the angels, and so we should stop.
There is no male or female in Christ Jesus.
Right. Therefore, let's stop having sex now, And Paul's like, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're up to it, by all means, try, but most cases, probably not.
Yeah. Any last thoughts that you want to give before we wrap this up?
The only other thing I'll say is that, my one concern, I started off the book, had a working title of like the ABCs of the New Testament. And I had people who had been to seminary, pastors and people like that reading it. And they were like, yeah, this is not just the ABCs, right? This is going into the details. And so just that it is written, hopefully, so that anyone can read it and understand it. But it doesn't stop with the kinds of things that if you've dabbled a little bit in scholarship or taken a class that you necessarily know, it does try to get into some of the more advanced stuff, but in a readable and fun way.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it's not, it's not like a Bible dictionary, right? Going, in this chapter, we'll cover all the mentions of Aaron and Aardvark and whatever else, things like that. It's the 26 chapters, each starting with a different letter, is really just a gimmick. And in some cases, you could probably tell that I had to try really hard to figure out a way to make that work. And the book is probably going to be translated into other languages, and I'm bumping up against the fact that some other languages
that doesn't work. It
doesn't work, and then making the puns might not work, and so. But it is just it's not a reference book. It is a book that's designed hopefully to be readable and enjoyable and fun. And I'm very active online because I care about informing the general public. That's why I do YouTube stuff. That's why I have a blog and things like that. And so I hope that people who read the book, the one last thing I'll say is that I'd love to hear from you, right? If the book, if it ever has a second edition, could be better, if there's something that wasn't as clear as it could be, or there's something you really liked about it, and I should keep mentioning that in my classes, things that, I raised questions but didn't answer them, because any good book on any subject will do that. Ask me. I'm easy to find online as Religion Prof.
Yeah. So why not the Alpha and Omega of the New Testament? That might have had a slightly different connotation. Yeah.
Right. I've had people ask that, and it's precisely because this was for English speakers who might not get the reference, right?
Yeah.
Didn't want to assume that Greek and know Alpha and Omega, that's basically how you'd say A to Z, right? If you were a Greek speaker. And so I did, I had a terrible idea for a cover design where it might have had like children's blocks with like A and Z on one side, and you could see there was Alpha and Omega on the other, or something like that. And I'm glad Erdman's decided to go with something else, because they're much better at this than I am.
So what's the future hold for you? It sounds like you have some books about John the Baptist coming out, but it sounds like you kind of mostly did your part of that already. What are some of your future research subjects that you're excited to get going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I think that John the Baptist is probably going to be a focus for some time to come. And so I'm definitely going to be working on some smaller things related to that. I felt like every chapter in the big John the Baptist monograph that I wrote could have been a book. And the reason I didn't say, okay, let me just take one of these and do a book, is that nobody wanted a multi-volume set on John the Baptist, right? Hopefully, if I raise enough possibilities in the book, then there will be other studies, and maybe we'll get to that point where people will take that level of interest in him. But at this point, I was like, this is enough. But there will be further things on John the Baptist. I'm sure I'll be doing further things on the Mandaeans. I am seriously interested, if seriously is the right word, in doing something about whether Jesus used humor. I think that's an interesting possibility that I'd love to explore.
Yeah.
Have some thoughts on the synoptic problem I might get to. And eventually would like to bring some of this work on John the Baptist and what I did in my book, What Jesus Learned from Women, and really just explore, as a question in and of itself, whether we can identify turning points in the life of Jesus, the human life of Jesus, so that we can actually kind of trace the development of his thought in a way that I think most historians have said we can't, because the sources are not really conducive to that. It's hard to do with ancient figures. It might be impossible, but I think it's partly been reverence, like the fact that even people who affirm as a matter of doctrine that Jesus was fully human will still not feel entirely comfortable, often because they're not as orthodox as they think they are, but will not feel entirely comfortable talking about Jesus thinking, right? Jesus learning, and things like that.
Growing in wisdom and stature.
Yes, yeah. I think is a key text there.
So I have noticed that there is a little bit of a gap on that subject. Like there are tons of thought projects on what was Paul influenced by, what was John influenced by, and stuff like that. But there's very little of exactly how did Jesus come to think what Jesus thought, and what were the influences on him, and what were his unique contributions. Obviously, there's some about that, but I do feel like it's strangely neglected.
Yeah. And so I have a book idea for that too, but basically finished up some things and then dove back into teaching this academic year. And it's actually really nice to be able to just tinker with and think about and mull some things over and not rush to a new topic. So when I figure out what it is, we'll have another conversation then.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for your time, James. Thank you very much for your book, A to Z of the New Testament. I'll include a link down in the description of this video. I highly recommend it. I enjoyed it myself. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Looking forward to it already. Thanks so much, Sam.